More UFC champions are strikers and not wrestlers. But why? If you ask the MMA community what the best base in the UFC is right now, I would say a vast majority of people would pick wrestling over everything, including striking. But despite this, of the 8 champions we have now in the UFC, only 2 of them have a heavy wrestling base, with Alexandre Pantoja coming from a jiu-jitsu background and the rest of the champions primarily being strikers. Now, there's definitely a couple asterisks with this breakdown. Islam Makhachev has a combat sambo background, which isn't purely wrestling, as it does mix in solid striking as well, and Islam has proved to be a pretty elite striker in his own regard, but still, for the most part, his style is very wrestling heavy. And Volkanovski did technically start with Greco-Roman wrestling when he was 12 and was even a national champ, but considering the style he adopted in his early MMA career up until now has pretty much been striking, and the way he dominates or finishes his fights is essentially through elite striking, I would still consider him a striker. Anyways, this amount of strikers at the championship level is appalling, given the fact that just 5 years ago, this is what the lineup of champions looked like at the end of 2018. As you can see, the state of the UFC champions up until this point has been dominated by wrestlers, essentially from top to bottom, from decorated Olympic wrestler Henry Cejudo at flyweight. You obviously have one of the most dominant wrestlers at lightweight with Khabib, and then you have your quintessential American collegiate wrestlers at the top with Tyron Woodley, John Jones, and DC. Out of the 8 champions, you can only really consider 3 of these guys strikers, though Robert Whittaker has proven to have a more well-rounded game and has definitely ventured out of his original karate base. And TJ Dillashaw, despite being mostly a great striker in the UFC, has had a strong wrestling base as a D1 wrestler back in college. Though slowly but surely, every year, strikers slowly took the show from wrestlers until we got to this point now where they have taken the majority. So what happened? Is striking the better base for MMA now? What happened to everyone saying wrestling is the best base for MMA despite a majority of champions being strikers? And what if I were to say that the two can kind of coexist? Today we're going to go through a couple of my answers and theories as to why there are more strikers as champions than wrestlers, despite wrestling being the consensus best base for MMA. So the simple and go-to answer is that strikers have simply just evolved. There's this narrative that striking has caught up to elite wrestling, and it definitely shows from Leon's recent performance. Leon Edwards this past weekend dominated Colby Covington in not just striking, but basically every facet of the game. He was fearless when it came to the wrestling Colby was obviously going to come with, but additionally, he invited some of the grappling exchanges as well. Like in this last round where Leon was able to take down Colby and actually attacked his back pretty well up until the point where Colby was able to get out and basically win the only round that he won because of this mistake. But still, what I've been very impressed with in the case of Leon is his phenomenal takedown defense and new comfortability in the grappling department. We first saw this in his first title defense and third fight with Kamaru Usman, where he stuffed a vast majority of the takedowns and completely evolved from his last 2 fights with Kamaru. And I think Leon is a prime example of the evolved striking that everyone is talking about. For the most part, elite strikers' game plan has always been to simply survive the wrestling and nothing else, and wait for a window of opportunity to knock their opponent out. Now you have guys like Leon Edwards and Volkanovski comfortable in the grappling department, trying to reverse positions, and sometimes even inviting the grappling too against high-level wrestlers. Now the only gripe I have with this take is that I don't think this is a widespread phenomenon like everybody on the internet is suggesting. I do agree with this new internet MMA take that strikers with good takedown defense might be the best base for MMA, but I just don't think it's happening widespread throughout the UFC. Sean Strickland and especially Alex Pereira and Sean O'Malley have the typical striker game plan of surviving the grappling and taking advantage of the window they're given on the feet, and I don't think I've ever seen them invite the grappling against another strong grappler. But with Volk and especially Leon's evolution in the ground game, I think they are really paving the way for strikers with great takedown defense and grappling that's better than good enough to stay on the feet. Now we get into a little more interesting answer, which is strikers are pushed to championship status quicker than wrestlers. I've talked about this in my Dana White privilege video, but there's a real conflict of interest if the same organization controls both the rankings and the promotion of the fights. And with this conflict of interest means there's opportunities for fighters to get title shots quicker than others. We all know that elite strikers will always sell more than elite wrestlers, as typically casual fans just want to see knockouts over 5-round decisions of just top control. Let's look at the case of Bilal Muhammad and Merab. You can check this video out on a more detailed breakdown of Bilal's situation, but essentially he's been on a 9-fight win streak, with his last 5 wins being Gilbert Burns, a TKO over Sean Brady, Vicente Luque, Stephen Thompson, and Damian Maia. And despite this monstrous win streak, he is nowhere near a title shot with Leon. And Merab is kind of in the same position at 135, but maybe not as bad. Merab is on also a 9-fight win streak with dominant wins over former champs Jose Aldo and Petr Yan. But despite this run, Cheeto took his place for next in line at Sean O'Malley. And speaking of Sean O'Malley, I really feel like Sean O'Malley is an industry plant and was pushed into championship stardom by Dana because of his striking prowess. Let's look at his track to the top. After losing to Cheeto, he was basically fed guys like Thomas Almeida, the debuting Chris Moutinho, Julian Paiva, all of which went on to get beat to a pulp, with the odds showing they shouldn't have been there in the first place. And then out of nowhere, Sean O'Malley, as the 11th ranked contender, gets a shot at former champ Petr Yan, which is not a move Dana would make for any wrestler not named Hamzat. Anyway, Sean O'Malley's controversial win over Petr Yan would set up his opportunity with Aljamain, and just like that, he became champion. Strikers, for the most part, are more exciting than wrestlers, and if Dana and the UFC had the chance to put a striker on the fast track to championship status, he will do that 10 times out of 10. And now let's move on to a pretty boring answer, but realistic answer nonetheless. Circumstance. Of the 5 weight classes that are headed by strikers, 3 of them simply don't have or barely have elite wrestlers. If we look at 145, for example, the top 5 and really the top 8 outside of Brian Ortega is just all strikers across the board, which has allowed Volkanovski to practically win all of his title defenses by simply being the better kickboxer. And if we skip to middleweight, though the guys at the top have some grappling prowess, for the most part, the top contenders at middleweight just bang. And light heavyweight is practically the same thing, with maybe Magomed Ankalaev truly having elite grappling. Alex Pereira is a great example of the lack of true dominant wrestlers at the top of the middleweight and light heavyweight division, as he has become a champion in both divisions despite his lack of grappling and good takedown defense, because he really hasn't had to face a dominant wrestler on his track to the top. So basically, for this answer, there really isn't a widespread trend or conspiracy going around. It's just purely circumstance and coincidence that there are so many strikers at the championship level. So what's the true answer? In my opinion, it's more of the second and the third rather than the first. Sean O'Malley was favored by Dana to get a fast track to the top. As for Sean Strickland and Alex Pereira, like mentioned before, their weight classes had a lack of grappling, and so their path to the top really didn't have to face any elite grapplers. And outside of maybe Brian Ortega and Chad Mendes, Alexander Volkanovski really hasn't had to face elite grapplers to get to the top and stay at the top of the featherweight division. The only champion that really truly evolved their game and had to face the absolute best wrestlers in the division and even in the UFC is Leon Edwards, which makes his championship story even better. Leon really had to deal with Kamaru twice and Colby Covington and evolve his game to keep his belt, and is really the exception. So in conclusion, I think wrestling is still the best space for MMA, as it seems like the Dagestani and Chechen boys will continue to dominate with their strong wrestling style, and American wrestlers with tremendous power still seem to find their way at the top or are quickly rising contenders. But again, it's still very interesting that despite this, a majority of the UFC champions are strikers, and only time will tell whether or not this is an actual trend or just a set of perfect circumstances for a majority of weight classes to be dominated by a striker. Anyways, what do y'all think? What is the best base in MMA? Is it strikers with good takedown defense? Is it just dominant wrestlers still? I'd like to hear you guys' thoughts in the comments below. And as always, thank you for watching.